Good evening, all, and welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight, we follow the ribbons of asphalt that cut through America's darkest hours, where 18-wheelers crawl through the void between distant cities. The air carries diesel exhaust and something else, a metallic taste that clings to the back of your throat as you count mile markers that seem to repeat themselves. These accounts have been whispered across CB frequencies for decades, shared in hushed tones at truck stops where fluorescent lights flicker against windows black as oil. Veteran drivers speak of routes that shouldn't exist, of cargo manifests that change while you're not looking, and of passengers who climb aboard at rest stops that have been abandoned for years. The stories you're about to hear were transcribed from encrypted dispatcher recordings and the personal logbooks of drivers who simply vanished from their scheduled routes. If you find yourself drawn to the quiet horrors we share, stay with us. Subscribe to Buried Files and keep the night close. Danny Kowalski had been running the I-80 corridor for 15 years, and he knew every truck stop, every way station, every stretch of road where the state troopers like to hide between the overpasses. His Peterbilt 379 hummed steadily through the Nebraska darkness, the CB radio crackling with the occasional exchange between drivers still awake in the small hours. The digital clock on his dashboard read 2:47 a.m., and he was making good time on his run from Sacramento to Chicago. The load was routine, automotive parts for a Ford dealership, nothing unusual. The paperwork had been clean, the pickup smooth, and the dispatcher had given him a tight but manageable schedule. Danny preferred these overnight hauls. Less traffic, fewer four-wheelers cutting him off, and the hypnotic rhythm of the road helped him think. Tonight, though, something felt different. It started with the radio. At first, Danny thought it was just interference, a crackling sound that seemed to drift in and out of the CB channels. But as he adjusted the squelch and swept through the frequencies, the sound followed him. It wasn't static exactly, more like distant voices speaking in a language he couldn't identify. The words, if they were words, seemed to overlap and echo, creating a strange harmony that made his teeth ache. He turned the radio off. The silence that followed felt heavier than it should have. Danny rolled down his window slightly, letting the cold Nebraska air rush into the cab. The familiar sounds of the highway, the whistle of wind past his mirrors, the steady thrum of his diesel engine, the rhythmic thump of tire treads on asphalt, all seemed muted, as if the night itself had thickened around him. Mile marker 237 passed on his right, illuminated briefly in his headlights before disappearing into the darkness behind him. Danny had passed this marker countless times over the years, but tonight it looked different somehow. The numbers seemed to glow with their own pale light, and for just a moment, he could have sworn he saw a figure standing beside it. When he checked his side mirror, there was nothing there. He reached for his thermos of coffee, but his hand stopped halfway. In the reflection of the passenger window, he could see another truck following him. Its headlights were dim, yellowed, like the eyes of something old and tired. Danny checked his mirrors again. The road behind him was empty, but the reflection in the window remained, showing that phantom truck maintaining a steady distance behind his trailer. Danny's mouth went dry. He'd heard stories like this before, whispered between drivers at truck stops in the early morning hours. Ghost trucks, phantom loads, highways that led nowhere. He'd always assumed they were just road fatigue talking, the product of too many hours behind the wheel and too much caffeine. Now he wasn't so sure. The exit ramp for Kearney appeared ahead, and Danny considered pulling off. He could grab a shower, maybe catch a few hours of sleep in his sleeper berth, wait for dawn before continuing. But his delivery was time sensitive, and he was already cutting it close. He kept driving. As he passed the exit, the speedometer needle began to flutter. Danny frowned and tapped the gauge, but the needle continued to dance between 65 and 75, even though he could feel the truck maintaining a steady pace. The engine temperature looked normal. Oil pressure was fine, but something was definitely wrong. Mile marker 238 should have been next. But when the next marker appeared in his headlights, it read 237 again. Danny felt his heart rate spike. He'd been driving this route for years. He knew these mile markers by heart. There was no way he'd somehow turned around or taken a wrong turn. I-80 was a straight shot through this part of Nebraska, with no complex interchanges or confusing ramps. Yet there it was, mile marker 237, looking exactly as it had before. He keyed his CB radio, despite having turned it off earlier. The unit was dead, no power light, no static. Danny was sure he hadn't touched the power switch, but he reached over and turned it back on anyway. Instead of the usual channels, he heard only that strange, overlapping voice pattern from before. But clearer now. The sounds weren't in any language he recognized, but they seemed almost familiar, like half-remembered words from a dream. The phantom truck in his window reflection was closer now. Danny could make out details that shouldn't have been visible in the darkness. Rust patterns on the hood, a cracked windshield, and behind the wheel, a silhouette that didn't quite look right. The figure's head was tilted at an angle that suggested something broken, and its hands on the steering wheel appeared to have too many fingers. Danny pressed harder on the accelerator, but his speed remained constant. The engine responded normally, revs climbing as expected, but the landscape outside continued to scroll past at the same steady pace. It was as if the road itself was moving beneath him, carrying him forward regardless of his input. Mile marker 237 appeared again, and again. Each time, the marker looked slightly different. The first time, it had been a standard green highway sign. The second time, it seemed older, more weathered. Now it appeared to be made of wood, like something from a much earlier era of road construction. The numbers were carved deep into the surface, and they seemed to shift and blur when he wasn't looking directly at them. The air inside the cab was growing colder, despite the heater running at full blast. Danny could see his breath now. Little puffs of vapor that hung in the air longer than they should have. The windshield began to fog from the inside, and when he reached over to wipe it clear, his hand left a streak that revealed something impossible. The landscape outside wasn't Nebraska anymore. Through the clear patch on the windshield, Danny could see rolling hills covered in twisted trees that looked more like gnarled hands reaching toward the sky. The asphalt beneath his wheels had become something else. Rough cobblestones that clicked and rattled under his tires. In the distance, flickering lights that might have been lanterns or torches lined what appeared to be an ancient roadway. But when he looked through the side windows, he still saw the familiar flat expanses of Nebraska farmland, illuminated by the pale glow of a half moon. The contradiction made his eyes water and his head throb. The CB radio crackled to life on its own, and this time Danny could understand some of the words mixed in with the strange language. His own name, spoken in voices that sounded like they were coming from the bottom of a well. Coordinates that didn't match any mapping system he knew. And underneath it all, a low humming sound that seemed to resonate in his bones. Mile marker 237 passed again, but this time, Danny was ready for it. He grabbed his logbook and pen, determined to mark the exact time and create some record of what was happening. But when he looked at the page, his previous entries were gone. The pages that should have contained days of trip records were blank, as if they'd been erased. The phantom truck in his reflection was now directly beside him, matching his speed perfectly. Danny could hear its engine, a deep, rattling sound like grinding metal and breaking glass. The driver turned to look at him, and Danny saw his own face staring back, but wrong somehow. The eyes were too wide, the mouth was open in a silent scream, and there were dark stains running down the cheeks like tears made of oil. Danny yanked the wheel hard to the right, pulling onto what should have been the shoulder of the highway. Instead, his truck rolled to a stop in a field of tall grass that whispered and moved without any wind. The engine died on its own, and the sudden silence was absolute. In that silence, Danny could hear footsteps approaching his truck. Slow, deliberate steps that crunched on gravel that wasn't there. The CB radio hissed softly, and a voice that might have been his own spoke from the speaker. "Mile marker 237, you've been here before, Danny. You'll be here again." The footsteps stopped just outside his door. Danny sat frozen in his seat, afraid to look, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. In the reflection of his side mirror, he could see mile marker 237 standing in the grass beside his truck, its wooden surface now black and charred, as if it had been pulled from a fire. The numbers still glowed with that pale, cold light. He closed his eyes and counted to 10, the way his father had taught him to do when he was scared as a child. When he opened them again, he was back on Interstate 80, rolling past mile marker 238 in the pre-dawn darkness. His CB radio was playing a country music station, and the speedometer read a steady 68 miles per hour. Danny checked his logbook. The pages were filled with his handwriting, documenting a routine run from Sacramento to Chicago. Everything was normal, exactly as it should be. But in his rearview mirror, mile marker 237 still glowed in the distance behind him, and he could swear he saw his own truck parked in the grass beside it, with a figure that looked like himself standing motionless in the headlights, waiting for the next driver to pass. The radio crackled softly, and somewhere in the static, Danny heard his own voice whisper, "Mile marker 237. He drove faster, but he knew he'd be back. Marcus Chen had been driving team runs for 8 years, but tonight he was running solo. His usual partner, Ray, had called in sick at the last minute, leaving Marcus to handle the cross-country haul from Portland to Atlanta alone. The 48-foot trailer behind his Kenworth was loaded with electronics, expensive cargo that required careful handling and tight security. The company had been reluctant to let him take it solo, but Marcus had convinced them he could handle the schedule. Now, 3 hours into the run on I-84 through the Columbia River Gorge, he was beginning to question that decision. The problem wasn't the driving. Marcus was comfortable behind the wheel, even on the winding mountain roads that carved through the Oregon landscape. The problem was the sounds coming from his sleeper berth. At first, he'd dismissed it as normal settling noises. Trucks made all kinds of sounds as they moved down the highway. Metal expanding and contracting, cargo shifting slightly despite being properly secured, the occasional groan from the suspension. But what he was hearing from behind the curtain that separated his cab from the sleeping area wasn't mechanical. It sounded like breathing, deep, rhythmic breathing, as if someone were sleeping back there. Marcus had checked the sleeper twice before leaving Portland. It was empty except for his personal gear, a duffel bag with a few changes of clothes, his toiletries, and a cooler with sandwiches and energy drinks. The narrow bunk was made up with fresh sheets, and the small storage compartments contained nothing unusual. There was no way anyone could have hidden back there. Yet the sound continued. a soft susurrus that seemed to match the rhythm of his own breathing, but slightly off, like an echo that arrived a fraction of a second too late. The digital clock on his dashboard read 11:43 p.m. as he passed through the small town of Cascade Locks. The streets were empty, windows dark except for the occasional gas station or late-night diner. Street lights created pools of yellow illumination that his truck passed through like a ship moving between lighthouses. Marcus reached for his CB radio and keyed the mic. "Breaker 19, this is westbound looking for an eastbound on I-84. Anyone copy?" Static answered him for several seconds before a gravelly voice responded. "Yeah, westbound. This is eastbound Charlie, about 10 miles ahead of you. Go ahead." "Charlie, this is gonna sound strange, but have you seen any vehicles stopped along the highway in the last few miles? Maybe someone looking for a ride?" A pause. "Negative, westbound. Highway's been empty as a grave out here. You missing a passenger?" Marcus almost laughed at the absurdity of it. "Something like that. Thanks, Charlie. Stay safe out there, driver. Charlie out." The breathing from the sleeper berth seemed to get deeper, more pronounced. Marcus could swear he felt the truck shifting slightly, as if additional weight had been added to the rear axles. He checked his mirrors, looking for any explanation, maybe another vehicle following too closely, its headlights creating shadows that might explain what he was experiencing. But the highway behind him stretched empty into the darkness. At the next way station, Marcus pulled over. The facility was closed for the night, the scale house dark and the parking area empty except for a few abandoned shopping carts that had somehow found their way there from town. He climbed out of the cab, the sudden silence after hours of engine noise making his ears ring. The air was cold and thin, carrying the scent of pine trees and river water from the Columbia below. Marcus walked around to the passenger side of his truck and pulled open the sleeper berth door. Empty. The bunk was exactly as he'd left it. Sheets still tucked in military-tight corners, his duffel bag sitting where he'd placed it. But the air inside felt different. Warmer, more humid, as if someone had been breathing in the confined space for hours. Marcus ran his hands along the walls and ceiling of the compartment, checking for any hidden spaces or loose panels where someone might have concealed themselves. Nothing. He even pulled out his duffel bag and checked inside, though he knew it was too small to hide a person. As he stood there in the cold night air, staring into the empty sleeper, he heard it again. The breathing, soft but unmistakable, coming from directly behind him. Marcus spun around. The parking lot was empty. No other vehicles, no people. Just the scattered shopping carts and the dark bulk of the way station building. But he could still hear it. Slow, measured breaths that seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. He climbed back into the cab and slammed the door, engaging the locks with more force than necessary. His hands were shaking as he reached for the ignition, and it took him 2 tries to get the key turned. The diesel engine rumbled to life, and Marcus felt some of his tension ease as he put the truck in gear and pulled back onto the highway. But as soon as he reached cruising speed, the breathing resumed. This time, Marcus decided to ignore it. Whatever was happening, fatigue, stress, some kind of auditory hallucination brought on by too much caffeine and not enough sleep. He couldn't afford to let it distract him from his delivery schedule. He had another 10 hours of driving ahead of him, and the cargo was worth more than he made in 6 months. He needed to stay focused. The radio crackled with occasional chatter from other drivers. A trucker heading west warned about a speed trap near the Dalles. Another reported construction delays in eastern Oregon. Normal, mundane communications that helped Marcus feel connected to the larger community of drivers sharing the highway with him. He even joined in a few conversations, describing the weather conditions and road surface reports. But between the radio calls, in the quiet moments when there was nothing but the sound of his engine and the whisper of tires on asphalt, he could hear his passenger breathing. Around 1:30 a.m., as he climbed into the Blue Mountains, Marcus felt the truck's performance change. The engine was working harder than it should have been for the grade, and the transmission was downshifting more frequently. He checked his gauges. Engine temperature was normal, oil pressure was good, but something was definitely wrong. At the next truck stop, a small facility carved into the mountainside near Baker City, Marcus pulled in for fuel and a mandatory break. The parking lot was nearly full, dozens of trucks lined up in neat rows like sleeping giants. Most had their running lights on, but their main engines off. Drivers catching mandatory rest in their sleepers. As Marcus climbed out to fuel up, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. His truck was sitting noticeably lower in the rear than it should have been. The rear suspension was compressed as if he were carrying a much heavier load than what was listed on his manifest. He walked around to the back of the trailer and checked the seals on the doors. They were intact, exactly as they'd been when he'd picked up the load in Portland. But something was wrong with the weight distribution. His truck was handling like it was carrying an additional several thousand pounds. Inside the truck stop, Marcus approached the clerk, a tired-looking woman in her 50s who was restocking coffee supplies behind the counter. "Excuse me," he said. "You folks got a scale here? I think I might have a weight problem." She looked up from her work. "Cat scale's out back, but it's been acting up all week, giving weird readings. Most drivers just skip it and wait for the next weigh station." "What kind of weird readings?" The woman paused, studying his face. "Trucks showing heavier than they should be. Sometimes a lot heavier. Had one driver yesterday swore his empty trailer was showing 40,000 pounds on the scale. Thought he was losing his mind." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Did he figure out what was wrong? Nope. Drove on to the next scale, and everything was normal. "Like I said, our scale's been acting up." Back at his truck, Marcus stood in the parking lot and stared at his rig. In the harsh glare of the sodium lights, everything looked normal. The trailer sat at the right height, the tires showed no signs of unusual wear, and the load securement was exactly as it should be. But he could swear the truck was sitting lower than when he parked it. He walked around to the sleeper door again, hesitating with his hand on the handle. The breathing sound was audible even from outside the truck now, a soft rhythm that seemed to synchronize with his own heartbeat. Marcus took a deep breath and pulled the door open. A smell hit him immediately, not unpleasant, but strange. It reminded him of his grandmother's attic, all dust and old, fabric and the faint sweetness of dried flowers. The air inside the sleeper felt thick, almost syrupy, and warmer than it should have been. On the bunk, the sheets were rumpled now, as if someone had been lying there. The impression of a human form was clearly visible in the mattress: head, shoulders, the curve of hips. But there was something wrong with the proportions. The depression was too long, as if whoever had been sleeping there was much taller than any normal person. Marcus reached out to touch the sheets and jerked his hand back. They were warm, not just warm from residual body heat, but actively warm, as if someone had just gotten up and walked away. He could even detect a faint pulse in the fabric, like a slow, steady heartbeat. "Who are you?" he whispered into the empty sleeper. The breathing stopped. In the sudden silence, Marcus could hear everything. The distant hum of highway traffic, the murmur of voices from other drivers in the parking lot, the ping of cooling metal from his engine. But from the sleeper berth, nothing. Then, so softly he almost missed it, a voice answered him. It sounded like his own voice, but tired, infinitely tired, as if spoken by someone who hadn't slept in years. "I'm going home." Marcus slammed the door and ran back to the truck stop, his heart hammering against his ribs. He burst through the entrance, startling the clerk, and fumbled for his cell phone. He needed to call his dispatcher, tell them he couldn't complete this run, that something was seriously wrong. But when he pulled out his phone, the screen showed no signal. That was impossible. This truck stop was on a major highway, and he'd had full bars just an hour ago. The clerk looked at him with concern. "You okay, honey? You look like you've seen a ghost." Marcus stared at her, then looked back through the window at his truck. In the distance, he could see a tall figure standing beside his sleeper door, barely visible in the shadows between the parking lot lights. The figure was looking directly at him through the truck stop window. It was himself, an exact duplicate, but wrong somehow. Too tall, too thin, with eyes that reflected the light like an animal's. When Marcus blinked, the figure was gone. The clerk was still watching him with worried eyes. "Honey, maybe you should get some rest. You look like you've been driving too long." Marcus nodded slowly. "Yeah, maybe I should." But as he walked back toward his truck, he knew he wouldn't be sleeping tonight. In the sleeper berth, someone was waiting for him. Tommy Valdez had a rule about hitchhikers: never pick them up. In 22 years of long-haul trucking, he'd seen enough roadside disasters and heard enough cautionary tales to know that stopping for strangers was asking for trouble. But tonight, on a desolate stretch of Highway 50 through the Nevada desert, something made him break that rule. The woman was standing beside what looked like a broken-down sedan about 50 miles east of Carson City. Her car's hazard lights blinked weakly in the darkness, and she waved frantically at his approaching headlights. Tommy normally would have called it in on his CB and kept rolling. But something about her posture, the way she stood with her arms wrapped around herself against the desert cold, reminded him of his daughter Sarah. He pulled his Freightliner onto the shoulder, air brakes hissing as the truck came to a stop. Through his passenger window, he could see the woman more clearly now. She appeared to be in her 30s, wearing a light jacket that wasn't nearly warm enough for the October night. Her car, an old Honda Civic, sat at an odd angle with its hood up and steam rising from the engine compartment. Tommy rolled down his window. "You need help, ma'am." She approached the truck, her footsteps crunching on the gravel shoulder. "My car overheated. I've been out here for almost 2 hours. My phone has no signal." Her voice carried a slight accent that Tommy couldn't quite place. "Where are you heading?" he asked. "Reno. I know it's out of your way, but I can pay for gas money. I just need to get there tonight." Tommy checked his watch. 11:15 p.m. Reno was actually on his route. He was hauling computer equipment to Sacramento, and Highway 50 would take him right past the city. "I can drop you at a truck stop in Reno, but I got rules. No drugs, no alcohol, no drama." Her face lit up with relief. "Thank you so much. I'll get my bag." As she walked back to her car, Tommy noticed something odd. The woman's footprints in the sandy shoulder were clearly visible in his headlights, but they seemed to stop abruptly about 10 feet from her Honda. It was as if she had appeared beside the road rather than walked from her disabled vehicle. She returned with a small overnight bag and climbed into the passenger seat. Up close, Tommy could see that her clothes, while clean, had an old-fashioned cut to them, like something from decades past. Her perfume was subtle but strange, carrying undertones of flowers he couldn't identify. "I'm Maria," she said, settling into the seat and buckling her seatbelt. "Tommy, you comfortable? It's going to be about an hour to Reno." "Perfect. I really can't thank you enough." Tommy put the truck in gear and pulled back onto the highway. In his mirrors, he watched Maria's Honda grow smaller and disappear into the darkness. The hazard lights continued blinking like a fading beacon. For the first few miles, Maria sat quietly, staring out at the desert landscape. The Nevada night was clear and cold, with more stars visible than most city dwellers ever saw. The highway stretched ahead of them, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the emptiness. "You do this run often?" Maria asked eventually. "Couple times a month. Been driving this route for 15 years. Usually pretty quiet out here." "Quiet can be good. Sometimes it's the only time you can really think." Tommy glanced at her. In the green glow of his dashboard lights, her profile looked almost ethereal. "You from Reno originally?" "No, I'm from further away, but I have business there." Something in her tone discouraged further questions, so Tommy focused on driving. The CB radio crackled occasionally with distant chatter from other truckers, but Highway 50 was largely empty at this hour. This stretch of Nevada was known as the loneliest road in America, and tonight it lived up to that reputation. About 20 minutes later, Tommy noticed headlights in his mirrors. Another vehicle had caught up to them and was maintaining a steady distance behind his trailer. That wasn't unusual. Faster cars often followed trucks through the mountains to take advantage of the cleared path and better visibility. But when he checked the mirrors again a few minutes later, the headlights were gone. "Looks like your car's still running," Maria said suddenly. Tommy looked at her in confusion. "What do you mean?" She pointed past him, out the driver's side window. "Your friend back there." Tommy looked and felt his blood turn cold. Pacing his truck in the left lane was the Honda Civic, Maria's supposedly broken down Honda Civic. Its hood was down now, and it was running smoothly, keeping perfect speed with his rig. Through the windshield, he could see a figure behind the wheel. It looked like Maria. "That's impossible," Tommy said, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. "Your car was dead. We left it 50 miles back." Maria turned to look at him, and in the dashboard lights, her eyes seemed to reflect like an animal's. "Did we?" Tommy checked his mirrors frantically. The Honda was gone again, but now there were multiple sets of headlights behind him, 5 or 6 vehicles following in a loose convoy. They maintained perfect spacing and identical speeds, like a funeral procession. "How many people were with you?" Tommy asked, his voice barely steady. "Just the ones who needed rides." The temperature inside the cab seemed to drop 20 degrees. Tommy reached for the heater controls, but they were already set to maximum. His breath began to fog in the sudden cold. "Look, lady, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but no game, Tommy. Just passengers who need to get where they're going." In his peripheral vision, Tommy could see that the passenger seat was no longer occupied by just Maria. There were shadows of other figures, indistinct shapes that seemed to shift and multiply when he wasn't looking directly at them. The cab felt crowded, filled with the presence of people he couldn't quite see. The radio crackled to life on its own, and Tommy heard his own voice speaking. "Breaker 19, this is Tommy Valdez eastbound on Highway 50. I've got passengers now. They need rides." Tommy grabbed the CB microphone, but his hands passed right through it. The device was still there, still crackling with transmissions, but he couldn't touch it. When he tried to reach for the steering wheel, his hands encountered nothing but air, even though he could see his fingers wrapped around the wheel. "What's happening to me?" he whispered. "You stopped," Maria said, her voice now coming from everywhere and nowhere. "You broke your rule. You picked us up." The convoy of vehicles behind him was growing. In his mirrors, Tommy could count dozens of headlights now. Cars, trucks, motorcycles, even what looked like a horse-drawn wagon. All of them maintaining that same perfect formation, all following his freightliner through the Nevada desert. "We've all been waiting," Maria continued, "standing by our broken-down cars, our empty gas tanks, our flat tires, waiting for someone kind enough to stop. Someone like you." Tommy tried to press the brake pedal, but his foot found only empty space. The truck continued at a steady 65 miles per hour, guided by hands he could no longer feel on a wheel he could no longer touch. "Where are we going?" he asked. "The same place we were always going. The same place everyone goes eventually." The landscape outside was changing. The familiar desert scrub was giving way to something else. Rolling hills covered in mist, trees that looked more like monuments than living plants. The highway remained solid beneath his wheels, but everything else had transformed into something that belonged to no map Tommy had ever seen. In the distance, he could see lights that might have been a city, but they flickered and wavered like candles in the wind. The stars above had rearranged themselves into patterns that hurt to look at directly. "Reno?" Tommy asked hopefully. "In a way. Everyone's final destination looks like home at first." The convoy behind him had grown enormous now. Hundreds of vehicles stretching back into the darkness, all carrying passengers who had once stood beside broken-down cars on lonely highways. Tommy could see them clearly now in his mirrors. Men and women and children from different eras, all wearing the clothes of their time, all with the same patient expressions of people who had been waiting a very long time for a ride. And at the front of the convoy, directly behind his trailer, was his own freightliner. Tommy could see himself behind the wheel, a perfect duplicate, but with eyes that stared straight ahead without blinking. "When did I break down?" he asked. "About 50 miles back, right around the time you saw me standing by my car." Tommy tried to remember stopping, but the memory was hazy. Had he pulled over for some reason? Had his truck developed a problem he couldn't recall? "The tow truck will find you in the morning," Maria said gently. "Heart attack, they'll say. Probably happened quickly. You're lucky. Some of us waited by the roadside for decades before someone stopped." The lights ahead were growing brighter, and Tommy could make out buildings now. Familiar structures that reminded him of his childhood home in El Paso. But somehow improved, perfected. The air in the cab was warming again, filled with the scent of his mother's cooking and the sound of his daughter's laughter from when she was small. "It's not so bad," Maria said. "And now you get to help others, like you helped me." Tommy looked in his mirrors one last time. The convoy stretched behind him like a river of lights, carrying all the lost travelers who had ever needed a ride home. At the very back, barely visible in the distance, he could see a new figure standing beside a broken-down freightliner. The figure was waving frantically at the approaching headlights, hoping someone would be kind enough to stop. Tommy smiled and pressed the accelerator, eager to pick up his first passenger. Frank Morrison had been running freight between Memphis and Phoenix for 12 years, and he knew every truck stop, every diner, and every rest area along U40. So when he saw the sign for Desert Rose Truck Plaza at mile marker 311 in eastern Arizona, he knew something was wrong. There had never been a truck stop at mile marker 311. Frank checked his GPS, but the display showed only static. His atlas, dog-eared from years of use, indicated nothing but empty desert between Holbrook and Winslow. Yet there it was, a fully lit truck stop with diesel pumps, a restaurant, and what looked like a small motel, all gleaming under sodium lights that turned the surrounding desert an eerie orange. His fuel gauge showed a quarter tank, more than enough to reach Flagstaff. But something about the sight of those lights in the vast darkness made him signal and take the exit. Frank told himself it was professional curiosity. Truckers talked, and news of a new stop on this route would have spread through the CB networks within days. The off-ramp curved around a low hill, and as Frank descended toward the facility, he noticed how quiet his radio had become. The usual chatter from other drivers had faded to silence, leaving only the steady hum of his Cummins engine and the whisper of tires on asphalt. The parking lot was about half full, maybe 20 trucks arranged in neat rows beneath tall light poles. Frank recognized some of the rigs. A distinctive flame-painted Peterbilt that belonged to a driver called Phoenix Phil. A well-maintained Kenworth that he'd seen at the Flying J in Amarillo just last week. Normal trucks driven by drivers he knew, which made him feel better about the unexpected stop. Frank pulled into an empty space and shut down his engine. The sudden silence felt heavier than it should have, as if the desert night had thickened around the truck stop like syrup. He climbed down from the cab, his boots crunching on gravel that seemed unusually white in the artificial lighting. The fuel island was modern, with digital displays and credit card readers that looked like they'd been installed yesterday. But when Frank ran his card through the reader, it processed the transaction using an authorization method he didn't recognize. No signature required, no PIN. Just a green light that seemed to stay on longer than necessary. As he fueled his truck, Frank looked around at the other vehicles. The trucks all appeared normal from a distance, but up close, small details seemed off. Phoenix Phil's flame paint job, which Frank remembered as bright orange and red, now appeared muted, as if the colors had faded over many years. The chrome on the nearby Kenworth was dulled with what looked like decades of road grime, despite appearing pristine from across the lot. The fuel pump clicked off, showing exactly 150 gallons, a number that felt too round, too convenient. Frank's tank held 200 gallons, and he'd started with a quarter tank. But the math didn't feel right somehow. Inside the truck stop, fluorescent lights hummed with a frequency that made Frank's teeth ache. The layout was familiar: aisles of snacks and road supplies, coffee stations, a small restaurant area with vinyl booths and a lunch counter. But the products on the shelves looked wrong, like generic versions of brands he knew. The Coca-Cola logo was almost right, but the font was slightly different. The Marlboro packs had the correct colors, but the wrong proportions. Behind the counter stood a woman in her 50s, with graying hair and a name tag that read, Dorothy. She smiled when Frank approached, but the expression didn't reach her eyes. "Evening, hun. Getting some fuel?" "Yeah, just topped off. Nice place you got here. How long you been open?" Dorothy's smile flickered. "Oh, seems like forever. You heading west?" "Phoenix. Been running this route for years. Never noticed this stop before." "Well, we're not on all the maps yet. Still getting ourselves established." She paused, studying Frank's face. "You look tired, hun. Maybe you should stay the night. We got clean rooms, reasonable rates." Frank hadn't planned to sleep. He was making good time and wanted to reach Phoenix by morning. But something about Dorothy's suggestion felt compelling, as if the idea had been planted in his mind rather than offered. "I should keep moving. Got a tight delivery schedule." course you do. But the desert can be dangerous at night. A lot of accidents on that stretch between here and Flagstaff. Animals on the road, sudden weather changes. Much safer to rest up and leave at dawn. The restaurant area was busier than Frank had expected for 2 a.m. A dozen truckers sat in the booths, eating meals and drinking coffee. Frank recognized several faces, drivers he'd seen at truck stops from California to Tennessee. They all looked up when he entered, nodding in that universal acknowledgement truckers gave each other. But something about their expressions seemed distant, unfocused. Frank slid into an empty booth and picked up the laminated menu. The offerings were standard truck stop fare: burgers, fried chicken, breakfast served all day. But the prices were listed in handwritten numbers that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. A waitress appeared beside his table. She was young, maybe 25, with blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail and a uniform that looked like it belonged in a 1950s diner. Her name tag read, Susie. "What can I get you, sweetie?" "Just coffee and maybe a piece of pie." "Apple or cherry?" Frank almost said apple, then hesitated. He always ordered apple pie, had been ordering apple pie at truck stops for more than a decade. But tonight, for reasons he couldn't explain, he said, "Cherry." Susie's smile brightened. "Good choice. Cherry's our specialty." As she walked away, Frank noticed that her footsteps made no sound on the linoleum floor. He looked around the restaurant more carefully. The other truckers were eating and talking, but he couldn't quite make out their conversations. The words seemed to blur together, like voices heard through water. The coffee arrived in a heavy ceramic mug that radiated warmth. It tasted perfect, exactly the way truck stop coffee should taste. But there was an underlying flavor Frank couldn't identify. Something sweet and metallic, like copper pennies dissolved in honey. The cherry pie was enormous, a slice that would have satisfied 2 normal appetites. The crust was golden brown, the filling a deep red that seemed to glow under the fluorescent lights. Frank took a bite and closed his eyes. It was the best pie he'd ever tasted, filled with flavors that reminded him of his grandmother's baking when he was a child. When he opened his eyes, the restaurant had changed. The other truckers were still there, but now Frank could see them clearly. Their faces were pale, almost translucent, and their eyes reflected the overhead lights like mirrors. They were still eating, still moving, but with mechanical precision, as if they were going through motions they'd repeated thousands of times. Phoenix Phil sat 3 booths away, cutting into a steak that bled more than any cooked meat should. When Phil looked up and waved, Frank could see that his smile was too wide, stretching beyond the normal boundaries of his face. "Good pie, isn't it?" Susie had returned, refilling his coffee cup with liquid that looked more black than brown in the harsh lighting. "What is this place?" Frank asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Just a truck stop, sweetie. A place for tired drivers to rest." "How long have these guys been here?" Susie glanced around the restaurant. "Oh, they come and go. Some stay longer than others. Depends on how tired they are, I guess." Frank stood up abruptly, pulling a 20 from his wallet. "I need to get back on the road." "You sure? You've barely touched your pie, and it's such a long way to the next stop." "I'm sure." But as Frank headed for the door, he found his legs moving slower than they should. Each step felt like he was walking through thick mud. The exit seemed to be getting farther away instead of closer. "Most folks find it easier to just stay," Dorothy called from behind the counter. "No point fighting it, hun. This is where you were always heading anyway." Frank looked back at the truckers in the booths. Now he could see them clearly. Drivers he'd known over the years who had simply disappeared from the highways. Men who had left for routine runs and never arrived at their destinations. Never called home, never collected their final paychecks. They were all here, eating endless meals in a truck stop that existed between destinations. A place for drivers who had run their last mile but didn't know how to stop. "We've been waiting for you, Frank," Phoenix Phil called out, his voice echoing strangely in the restaurant. "Saved you a seat." Frank reached for the door handle, but his hand passed through it like it was made of smoke. Outside, he could see his truck sitting in the parking lot. But it looked different now, older, covered with the dust of decades instead of days. "The thing about the last stop," Dorothy said gently, "is that you don't really choose to make it. It chooses you." Frank turned back to the restaurant. The empty booth where he'd been sitting now had a plate of cherry pie waiting for him, the slice exactly as large as when he'd first been served. Steam rose from a fresh cup of coffee. Phoenix Phil patted the seat beside him. "Come on, Frank. Rest up. We got all the time in the world now." Frank walked back to the booth, his footsteps making no sound on the linoleum. Outside, the desert stretched endlessly in all directions. But Highway 40 was nowhere to be seen. There was only the truck stop, glowing like a beacon in an ocean of darkness, welcoming weary travelers who would never need to travel again. He sat down and picked up his fork. The cherry pie tasted just as perfect as before, sweet and warm and somehow familiar, like a flavor from a dream he'd been having his entire life without knowing it. In the parking lot, his truck waited patiently, ready for a journey that would never end. Eddie Reeves always drove with his CB radio on Channel 19, the truckers' channel, where drivers shared road conditions, speed traps, and the kind of casual conversation that made the long miles feel shorter. Tonight, running a load of farm equipment from Des Moines to Denver, the radio had been unusually quiet. Just static and the occasional weather report from distant stations bleeding through the atmospheric interference. Eddie was used to solitude. He'd been an owner-operator for 18 years, hauling everything from refrigerated goods to construction materials across the Midwest. But something about tonight's silence felt different, almost expectant, as if the radio waves themselves were holding their breath. He was 40 miles west of North Platte, Nebraska, when the transmissions began. At first, it was just a whisper beneath the static. Voices too faint to understand, speaking in what sounded like numbers and coordinates. Eddie adjusted his squelch control and fine-tuned the frequency, thinking he might be picking up military or aviation communications. But as the signal strengthened, he realized the voices were using trucker terminology. "Eastbound at marker 247, got your ears on." "Copy that, driver. How's your back door looking?" "Clean and green all the way to the state line." Normal CB chatter, except for one problem. Eddie was currently at mile marker 247, and there was no eastbound traffic visible in either direction. The Nebraska highway stretched empty in both directions, illuminated only by his headlights and the pale glow of a quarter moon. Eddie keyed his microphone. "Breaker 19, this is westbound Eddie at marker 247. I copy you eastbound drivers, but I don't see you on the highway. What's your 20? Silence answered him. Not even static now, just a complete absence of sound that made Eddie wonder if his radio had suddenly died. He checked the power light, tapped the microphone, even switched to channel 9 and back to 19. Nothing. Then, as if someone had turned up the volume, the voices returned, clearer now and much closer. "Eddie Reeves, westbound in the Blue Pete. We see you, driver." Eddie's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He hadn't identified himself or his truck over the radio. His Peterbilt was indeed blue, but in the darkness, that would be impossible to determine from any distance. "How do you know my name?" he transmitted. "Same way we know you're hauling John Deere equipment. Same way we know you got that photo of your granddaughter taped to your dashboard. We've been waiting for you to join us, Eddie." A chill ran down Eddie's spine. The photo of 7-year-old Emma was exactly where the voice said it would be, smiling at him from its place beside his logbook. But nobody could see inside his cab, and he'd never mentioned his cargo or family on the radio. "Who is this? How do you know that information?" "Look in your mirrors, Eddie." "Ah, we're right behind you." Eddie checked his mirrors and felt his breath catch. A convoy of trucks had appeared in the darkness behind him. 5, maybe 6 rigs running in tight formation without headlights. In the faint moonlight, he could just make out their shapes. Older trucks mostly, with the high hoods and chrome bumpers of models from decades past. How did you catch up so fast? I didn't see you coming." "We've been running this route a long time, Eddie. Longer than you might think. Why don't you pull over and join our convoy? Make the miles go by easier." Something in the voice's tone set off alarm bells in Eddie's head. He'd heard that same too-friendly cadence from lot lizards and con men at truck stops, the sound of someone trying to lure him into something he'd regret. "Thanks, but I'm making good time. I'll just keep running solo." The laughter that came through his radio was like gravel being poured into a metal bucket. "Solo? Look around, Eddie. Count the trucks." Eddie looked in his mirrors again. The convoy had grown. What had been 5 or 6 trucks was now at least a dozen, all running dark, all maintaining perfect formation. But that wasn't what made his blood run cold. In his passenger mirror, he could see another truck running parallel to him in the left lane, a truck that looked exactly like his own Peterbilt. Same blue paint, same chrome stacks, even the same company logo on the door. And behind the wheel of that duplicate truck, Eddie could see his own face staring back at him. "What the hell?" "Easy there, Eddie. No need to get excited. Just pull over and let us explain everything. You're gonna like being part of the convoy." Eddie pressed harder on the accelerator, but his truck's speed remained constant at 65 miles per hour. The speedometer needle was steady, his engine was responding normally, but the landscape outside continued to scroll past at the same measured pace no matter how hard he pushed the pedal. "Let me go," he said into the microphone. "Go where, Eddie?" "You're on Highway 80 heading west. Same as us, same as you always have been, same as you always will be." The convoy in his mirrors had expanded again. Now there were dozens of trucks, semis, delivery vehicles, even what looked like a few pickup trucks towing trailers, all running without lights, all moving in perfect synchronization. Eddie tried his cell phone, but the screen showed no signal. He reached for his satellite radio, hoping to contact his dispatcher, but the unit was dead despite showing a full power indicator. "Nobody can hear you now except us," the voice on the CB said. "Channel 19 is our frequency, has been for a long time." "What do you want?" "Same thing every trucker wants, Eddie. Company on the road, someone to talk to during the long hours, someone who understands the life." The duplicate of his truck was still running beside him, and now Eddie could see the driver more clearly. It was himself, but wrong. The face was too pale. The eyes were solid black, and the mouth was stretched in a smile that never wavered. "I've been driving alone for 18 years, Eddie said. "I don't need company." "Everybody needs company eventually. Gets lonely out here, doesn't it? Same roads, same truck stops, same load after load. Wouldn't it be nice to have drivers who really understand? Who've been through exactly what you've been through? Eddie looked more carefully at the trucks in his mirrors. Now he could make out details. Company logos from freight lines that had gone out of business decades ago. Truck models that hadn't been manufactured since the 1980s. License plates from states that no longer existed. "You're all dead," he whispered. Dead is such a harsh word, Eddie. We prefer to think of ourselves as permanently on the road. No more delivery schedules, no more DOT inspections, no more worrying about fuel prices or insurance premiums. Just the highway and the brotherhood of drivers. The convoy had surrounded him now. Trucks flanked him on both sides, filled his mirrors front and back. Eddie was trapped in the center of a rolling formation of vehicles that shouldn't exist, driven by men who should have been in graves instead of behind steering wheels. "The thing about trucking," the voice continued, "is that it gets in your blood, becomes part of who you are. Some of us just couldn't let it go when our time came. So we kept driving. I want out of this." "Out of what, Eddie?" "You're doing exactly what you've always done. Driving west on I-80, hauling freight, living the life you chose. The only difference is now you got convoy partners who'll never let you drive alone again." Eddie tried turning the wheel, but it wouldn't respond. His truck continued straight ahead, maintaining its position in the center of the ghostly convoy. The radio crackled with new voices now. Dozens of them, all talking at once in the easy familiarity of drivers who'd been running together for years. "Good buddy in the blue, Pete. Welcome to the convoy. Been waiting for a John Deere specialist. Got some loads need hauling. That granddaughter of yours. She'll understand why Grandpa can't visit anymore." "Stop," Eddie said, but his voice came out as barely a whisper. Outside, the landscape was changing. The familiar Nebraska farmland was giving way to something else. Rolling hills covered in mist, forests of trees that looked more like telephone poles. And in the distance, lights that might have been cities, but moved like living things. "This isn't I-80 anymore," Eddie said. "Sure it is. It's every highway, every route, every mile of road you've ever driven. All connected now, all leading to the same place." "Where?" "The depot, Eddie. The final terminal. Where all loads get delivered eventually." In the distance, Eddie could see it. A massive truck stop that stretched beyond the horizon, with thousands of bays and fuel islands and parking spaces filled with trucks from every era of American transportation. The lights never flickered, the fuel never ran out, and the drivers never had to sleep. "Welcome to the convoy, Eddie," the voice said as his truck rolled toward the depot. "You're gonna love it here. We all do." Eddie reached for the photo of his granddaughter, but his hand passed through it like smoke. In the passenger seat, another Eddie was already sitting there, smiling that same too wide smile. "Don't worry," his duplicate said. "I'll take good care of the truck and the route. Someone has to keep running the loads." Behind them, the convoy rolled on through the endless night, always recruiting, always growing, always making sure that no trucker ever had to drive alone. On Highway 80, a blue Peterbilt maintained its steady westward pace, while somewhere in the static between radio channels, Eddie Reeves tried to remember what it felt like to choose his own destination. Carl Hendricks prided himself on being meticulous about paperwork. In 30 years of hauling freight across the continental United States, he'd never had a discrepancy with a bill of lading, never lost a shipping document, and never failed a DOT inspection. His logbooks were models of precision. His cargo manifests matched his loads down to the last pound. And his truck maintenance records were so detailed they could have been used as training materials. So when Carl noticed that his manifest had changed sometime between Little Rock and Memphis, he knew something was seriously wrong. He'd picked up the load at a food processing plant in Arkansas. 10 pallets of frozen chicken bound for a distribution center in Detroit. Standard refrigerated cargo, nothing unusual about the pickup or the paperwork. Carl had checked the manifest 3 times before pulling away from the dock, a habit that had saved him from costly mistakes more than once in his career. The original manifest listed the cargo as Tyson Frozen Chicken Products, Grade A, 10 pallets, 18,500 pounds total. But now, as he sat in the sleeper berth of his Kenworth during his mandatory rest break at a truck stop outside Memphis, the document in his hands read something entirely different. Livestock, live transport, 47 head, 22,000 pounds total. Carl read the line 3 times, certain he was misunderstanding something. He pulled out his reading glasses and examined the manifest under the overhead light. The paper was the same. He recognized the coffee stain in the upper right corner from when he'd set his mug down too close to the paperwork back in Little Rock. But the words had definitely changed. He walked around to the back of his trailer and checked the seals on the doors. They were intact, exactly as they'd been when he'd left Arkansas. The refrigeration unit was running normally, maintaining the required temperature for frozen goods. Everything appeared normal, except for the impossible transformation of his shipping documents. Carl climbed back into his cab and spread the manifest on his dashboard, comparing it to the pickup receipt he'd gotten from the loading dock supervisor. The receipt still showed frozen chicken products, but the manifest now clearly indicated live cattle. As he stared at the conflicting documents, Carl became aware of a sound coming from behind him, a low rumbling that seemed to vibrate through the metal walls of his trailer. At first, he thought it might be the refrigeration unit cycling on, but the sound was deeper, more rhythmic. It almost sounded like breathing, heavy breathing from something very large. Carl grabbed his flashlight and walked back to his trailer. The refrigeration unit was humming quietly, but the other sound was definitely coming from inside the cargo area. He pressed his ear against the aluminum siding and heard it clearly now. Not just breathing, but movement. Shuffling, scraping sounds, as if something was shifting around in the confined space, something alive. He checked the seals again, looking for any sign of tampering. They were intact, but as Carl examined them more closely, he noticed that the serial numbers had changed. The seals he'd watched the dock supervisor apply had been numbered 74,832 and 74,833. These seals read 91,205 and 91,206. Carl's hands were shaking as he pulled out his cell phone and called his dispatcher. Morrison Freight, this is Janet. Janet, this is Carl Hendricks, truck 47. I've got a problem with my load documentation. What kind of problem, Carl? My manifest says I'm hauling live cattle, but I picked up frozen chicken, and the trailer seals have changed. A pause. Carl, you feeling okay? You've been driving too long? I'm fine, Janet. I'm telling you something's wrong with this load. Hold on. Let me check your dispatch record. Carl could hear typing in the background. Carl, according to our system, you picked up livestock from Ramirez Ranch outside Little Rock. 47 head of cattle bound for a slaughterhouse in Detroit. That's what your manifest should show. Carl stared at the phone. That's impossible. I was at a Tyson plant. I loaded chicken. Carl, Ramirez Ranch has been your pickup location for the last 15 years. Same route, same cargo. You okay, driver? Maybe you should pull over and get some rest. The line went dead. Carl tried calling back, but his phone showed no signal despite being in the middle of Memphis. He walked into the truck stop and used the payphone, but when he dialed the Morrison freight number, a recorded message told him the number was disconnected. Back at his truck, Carl found that his logbook had changed too. The entries he'd made over the past 3 days now showed pickups from Ramirez Ranch, cattle loads, routes he'd never driven. His handwriting, but documenting trips he'd never made. The sounds from the trailer were getting louder, along with the breathing and movement. Carl could now hear what sounded like lowing, the deep, mournful calls of cattle in distress. But underneath those sounds was something else, something that made his skin crawl. It sounded like voices, human voices, calling out in languages he didn't recognize. Carl walked to the front of his truck and opened the hood, pretending to check his engine while he tried to make sense of what was happening. In the reflection of his polished air filter housing, he could see his trailer clearly, but the reflection showed something that shouldn't be there. Shadows moving behind the aluminum walls, shapes too large and too angular to be cattle. He slammed the hood and leaned against his truck, breathing heavily. A trucker at the next pump over approached him. "You okay, buddy? You look like you've seen a ghost." Carl looked at the man. A typical over-the-road driver, middle-aged, wearing a company shirt from a freight line Carl recognized. Normal, real. "Yeah, just tired. Long run." "I hear that. What you hauling?" Carl hesitated. "Livestock." The other driver nodded. "Tough freight. Never could do the cattle runs myself. Too depressing, you know, all that mooing and carrying on. And the smell when you get to the processing plant?" He shook his head. "Rather haul steel or machinery. At least metal don't know where it's going." After the man walked away, Carl climbed back into his cab and examined his manifest again. The document now showed additional details that hadn't been there before. Special handling required. Do not open trailer under any circumstances. Deliver to Detroit Meat Processing, Dock 7, after midnight only. Carl had never heard of Detroit Meat Processing. His original destination had been a ConAgra distribution center on the east side of the city. He checked his GPS for the new address, but the device showed only static. When he tried to enter the address manually, the GPS kept reverting to his original destination. The trailer was rocking now, as if the cattle inside were becoming agitated. Carl could hear impacts against the walls, heavy thuds that made the entire rig shake. Whatever was in there was getting restless. He started his engine and pulled back onto Interstate 40, heading toward Interstate 55 north. He needed to get to Detroit and sort this out with whoever was expecting this load. But as he drove, Carl noticed that the mile markers weren't progressing in the right sequence. He passed marker 278 3 times, and the road signs began showing destinations he'd never heard of. Cities with names like Perdition and Nowhere and Last Chance. The CB radio crackled to life on its own. "Eastbound cattle hauler, this is your final destination calling." Carl grabbed the microphone. "Who is this? How do you know what I'm hauling?" "We've been waiting for you, Carl. Got the chutes ready, got the paperwork prepared. You're running a little behind schedule." "What schedule?" "I don't know what you're talking about." "Check your manifest, driver. Should have all the details." Carl looked down at the manifest on his passenger seat. The destination address was changing as he watched, the letters rearranging themselves. Eternal Processing, 666 Judgment Road, Detroit, Michigan, Netherworld Division. The sounds from his trailer had evolved into something that definitely wasn't cattle. Carl could hear screaming now, human screaming, in voices that spoke in dozens of different languages. Pleading, bargaining, praying in tongues he'd never heard but somehow understood. "What am I carrying?" he whispered into the microphone. "Souls, Carl. Same thing you've been hauling for 15 years. Folks who made certain choices, signed certain contracts. Time to collect on their debts." Carl checked his mirrors and saw that his trailer had changed. What had been a standard refrigerated unit was now something else entirely. Black metal inscribed with symbols that hurt to look at. Smoke rising from vents that hadn't been there before. "I never agreed to this. I haul freight, not whatever this is." "Check your employment contract, Carl. Read the fine print." Carl reached for his paperwork folder and pulled out his contract with Morrison Freight. But the company name had changed to Morrigan Transport, Infernal Division. And the job description now read, "Soul Collection and Transport Services. Driver agrees to eternal employment terms upon completion of training period." At the bottom of the contract, in Carl's own handwriting, was a signature he didn't remember making and a date from 15 years ago. "Welcome to your permanent route, Carl," the voice on the radio said. "Detroit's just the first stop. After that, we got pickups scheduled all over creation. Lots of folks ready for their final ride." Carl looked in his rearview mirror and saw other trucks forming up behind him. A convoy of black haulers, all carrying the same impossible cargo. In the distance, the lights of Detroit were visible, but they flickered red now instead of white. His CB radio crackled with new instructions. Coordinates, pickup schedules, and delivery requirements for a route that would never end. Carl reached for his logbook to document the trip, but his hands were no longer entirely his own. Someone else was guiding his movements now, filling out paperwork for destinations that existed on no earthly map. In the trailer behind him, the cargo had gone quiet, resigned to their fate. Carl wondered how long it would be before he joined them